Yeah, thank you very much. We are back. Let's round off what we were doing last time on the prose narrative we were trying to deal with. I guess you should be following. That should be kind of prose fiction, definitely, because, we're talking about what you arrive at, what you didn't know. Now, we've tried to look at how powerful language can be, especially when you are dealing with a bumpy road kind of narrative. Description, very important. The narrative flow. We talked about linguistic realism. And then let's talk a little bit about the dramatic in that very scenario. The dramatic. How do we often arrive at the dramatic within, prose fiction? We've happened on some of them. The ability to create suspense, like what happened when that phone call came to that woman. It even gives shock. That keeps our hearts racing. What's going to happen next and all that. Within a wedding scenario, okay? You want to deal with that and you want to keep on going. So descriptive power, narrative, eloquence, linguistic realism, linguistic flow must be something that must be very much at hand that we can use very well. Now, part of the dramatic will definitely be the dialogue, the way we employ dialogue. Dialogue can be highly interesting, very revealing, highly dramatic. It allows the pace of this plot to keep unfolding and to give us ideas of scenes, of character, and of space. Now, when we are dealing with dialogue, we've got to be very, very realistic as well. I told us about the imagined dialogue between a very educated person and the other one that is not as educated. Of course, it's going to be a situation in which the language must be at the equilibrium level where both can understand each other. We can also say this, that in the area of the dramatic, the dialogue can even form a very long form of narrative sequence. For instance, if you want to give us a picture of a charged environment and you want to excuse yourself of, the mental exertion of imageries and, forming pictures of moods and so on and so forth, you can help yourself by aligning some characters within the scenario of the plot at that moment to be in dialogue. Instead of going into description, just set them talking about what is going on and let it be fast-paced, so to speak. Let it show their anxieties. Let it show their surprises. Let it show their expectations. Let it even show their glooms, as the case may be. In times like this, when the dialogue is going on, you may imagine yourself as writing a drama script, which is definitely composed of dialogue. Also, what is mainly the main kernel of any dramatic literature is the dialogue. You can somehow, in the context of what is going on, just go on in a dramatic sequence. And dialogue can really, really be a way of opening up several things within a short distance of, narrative that could achieve the dramatic that the descriptive might not be able to do. The descriptive is just to give us the picture, but the dramatic as a way of letting us know things about tension, about conflict, about subjectivity, about the mood, about the environment, about time, about history, a number of things like that. So we can set that kind of context in. The dialogue can also reveal things that are unexpected, things that perhaps would have been what we would do as the story goes on, and it will have to take description and a lot of things like that. The dialogue can achieve that within a fast-paced moment. So the dialogue is something very important. But then the dialogue can't really be very, very convincing or much of an achievement if we have not created very persuasive characterization. Our characterization is something that allows us to see the humanity within that narrative sequence, the humanity of that narrative sequence. And when we talk about the humanity here, we are not just talking about individual characters alone. The things about protagonists, the antagonist, the hero, okay, the main character, the minor character, and so on and so forth. We might even also, through characterization, be able to depict a whole setting, a whole social setting. You know that if you are dealing with a riverine area, for example, all you need to do is to depict the humanity of that riverine area. Let us know how their lives are sustained by the river, how they go to the stream, how perhaps they have evolved some cultural practices because of their aquatic space, okay? And then you also want to let us know how the ecosystem of their riverine environment informs the way they see the world, how perhaps it creates mythology, the way they view the world, their relationship with other cultures, other peoples, and so on and so forth. You've got to be able to map that out. Then, what you are going to do, I'm suggesting there is no hard and fast rule about these things, but just a way to navigate how to write. Now, you might then have created some characters, protagonists, antagonists, some stop characters, as the case may be, that will allow flow of what you want to do in their lived experiences of life within that storyline. And that is something that must be nuanced. You must have heard about the Bill Dunn's romance, for instance, the story of life arrivals, the story of how the growing of characters into what they become eventually in life. It is a kind of life stream narrative, a kind of way of talking about the evolution of a particular character. In most cases, you are dealing with a protagonist there, and we are talking about the life evolution of that person from childhood onto maturation. Now, that kind of person might be in that kind of story, but of course, people don't exist alone. You are going to effectively create the people that matter to them and artistically that matter to the plot structure and the plot flow of that storyline. And in this kind of scenario, you are able to give us some very important revelations about what is going on. Now, surprises can also happen to characterization. All of a sudden, in a very, very peaceful environment, peaceful society, peaceful setting and all that, some people just come from the blues. They come from nowhere and they come into the setting of this particular community. And those people change the whole story that you have been familiar with. And then you have started another thing with characterization. You have started another discourse, perhaps. You have started an appendage to the storyline, which is part of the story. And that can keep going on depending on what you want to achieve with characterization. Now, the characterization definitely is part of the dramatic sequence, of course, of the storyline. But the way and manner you effectively manage this and make it convincing is the way by which we're going to know that you have really achieved something through your storyline. The characterization is not just something that you are going to create at the end of the day, because we told us about intertextuality. Your merging of characters that you had watched within a movie, observed within some stories that you have read in novels or plays, or the persona you have read about in a particular epic poem and all that could be matched up within a character, your own protagonist character, to allow you to navigate a number of discourses that you want to do within that storyline. To complement what you are doing, nowadays, it's such a very fascinating thing to see how writers blend the fictional with the factual. The fictional can be the aesthetic platform by which we are developing the plot structure. The factual could be the persuasive fun, the persuasive arsenal. You are going to make historicity very, very convincing within your storyline. So it's possible to actually give us real historical dates and data, real historical figures as part of your reference point in your storyline, real people that existed, and you can even, with some nuance, remember some things that happened within the storyline that you are constructing, and then you match it up with what you are doing in your storyline. For example, I can recall that Ngugi wa Thiong'o, I'm sure if you are a reader of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, that fantastic Kenyan writer, part of the very iconic people in African literature today, if you have read some of his novels, especially his early novels, you will find out a blend of fictional and the factual, even in his setting. Many times you will find his actual settings happening in Nairobi, the capital city of Kenya. But then, along the stories that happen in Nairobi, there is another one happening in a place he calls Ilmorog that has a kind of interface with the happenings in Nairobi. But what I found out later on, as I was reading about Ngugi some years back, was that Nairobi, as we know it, is a factual space, but the Ilmorog was actually his fictive creation. But if you read Ilmorog with Nairobi, somebody traveling from Nairobi to Ilmorog, you really ever thought, every time you read those pieces, you thought Ilmorog really existed. There are times it will bring about some names that really existed, like Dedan Kimathi, and it will align that real person, that historic person, with some characters that are his fictive creations, and they align. What becomes very interesting is that Ngugi had learned how to create persuasiveness, realistic portrayal of space, of people, of language, of events that really made his narrative collection very, very instructive, very, very discursive, very, very memorable, and of course, very, very evergreen. So a number of things we do there, happen to us. Now, I want to ask you, what do you think happens to crime investigators? What do you think happens to crime writers, crime story writers, when they write their pieces? For instance, you are looking at people like, I'm sure some of us here must have heard about a certain James Hadley Chase, thriller narrator, that will always, many times in wrote thrillers in those days. I'm talking about Hadley Chase of over 40 years ago and things like that. And they were always page turners. What do you think has happened to a number of people reading Hadley Chase from several worlds, in Asia, in Africa? Because Hadley Chase, even though a Western narrator and writing from a Western metropolis, got so successful that he was read everywhere in the world. At least I know that in Nigeria, in Africa, in a number of non-Western states, Hadley Chase was perhaps the canonical writer of thriller narratives. But do you know something? There are intertexts of Hadley Chase today. You can talk about Hadley Chase formats in, Mukoma wa Ngugi's Nairobi hit, for example. You can talk about an Hadley Chase memorial in writers that have been doing very interesting write-ups. For example, like H.J. Golakai, a Liberian who has been doing some fantastic crime fictions in African crime fiction. You can talk about people like Leia Dinley. You can see that Hadley Chase motif of writing when he's doing his crime fiction, and so many other people like that. So the point is this, that when we want to do a narrative sequence dealing with characterization, dealing with a dramatic exposure, we have got to be familiar with how to use language in a sequence of the dramatic, in the suspense mode, in a way that can be shocking, in the way that can be very, very surprising, in a way that brings in believable characters and characterization, and in the ways dialogues happen that make the storyline very, very interesting. Now, how do we conclude storylines? Of course, it's up to you how you want it. You want it to round up with a resolution that solves all the mysteries of the conflicts that have been raised within the narrative. You've got to be able to decide how to go about that and how to make it convincing, how this works up, how, for example, that lady that was captured, even though she goes through a lot of things, even though the family is traumatized and it affects the police system, it gets into the national media and so on and so forth. It gets into realms where there were really, really criminal events that happened, lives going for it and all that. They might want to make her saved at the end of the day. And then she becomes a story, perhaps addressing some things within the national space or the international space. Perhaps kidnapping her was not meant to actually be against her, but actually to sound a note of warning, maybe to a governmental arrangement that had marginalized some people, some particular members of the national state that are now bringing about their own attack, their own ways of saying no to their marginalization through the vehicle of kidnapping. It could be a novel that might be bringing stakeholders of the nation state or such communities informed within that storyline to a dialogue which can really be of mass benefits to everybody. You might want to do that. At times, some narrators might want to end that story, conclude that kind of story without solving the problem. Maybe they keep allowing suspense to reign until the end of the novel, so that we are in the blank. We wonder what happens to that person. And that also could be a style of making the novel very, very successful and very, very impactful. Or else, somebody might decide that, well, everybody becomes the victim of what has happened in one way or the other, whereas some other people might want it to be a way in which, some devices predominate, that maybe there are some unfortunate losses and there are some interesting recoveries, and that there are certain things that open up some other issues within perhaps the national space that is going on to bring about things that the media doesn't really get exposed to. It could be a kind of write-up that will be making us see those unsaid things within the media or within stories of such that are coming up within that kind of space. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure when you attempt to write your story, that is the story you plan to write, you have a whole lot of things you can leverage on through these lectures. And I'm hoping that this will be a very good purchase for you in your attempt to come up and be recognized as a formidable writer. Thank you very much. Make sure you like this channel, you subscribe, and then you share it. We are coming very soon for some other things. Thank you very much.